a biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
With all of the developments that are going on around the nation and some intensity coming upon the church, especially the church in Victoria, around all sorts of issues, it's not beyond us to talk about the idea of resistance. And Bill Muehlenberg's back with us today, and having written something like 200 articles on what he calls resistance theory over these recent years, back with us today talking about resistance and what that might mean, especially for believers when we're faced with some unjust, unbiblical laws. Bill Muehlenberg, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks again.
Bill, to illustrate the point of what it takes to be resistant, let's start with perhaps some biblical idea here of where we stand as Christian believers. And are we supposed to just bow to unbiblical laws, laws that go contrary to the character of God, or is there supposed to be some sort of resistance that Christians do?
Yeah, good question. Obviously, your key text, among others, is Romans 13, which talks about the state. God ordained it, and he's using it. But that's not the only passage, and for 2,000 years, Christians have thought about that text and others simply to say, well, Romans 13 does not say the state is absolute, only God is absolute, so the state should be ruling under God and according to his authority. But what happens when the state goes off the rails, starts either persecuting its people, or in our case, starts saying no to things that Christians need to say yes to? So there's always been that struggle, and especially at the time of the Reformation and onwards, people were asking, well, is there a time and a place to resist the state? Can Christians sometimes say no to bad government, at least those maybe who are leaders or officers, whether princes or kings? Is there a time and a place where there can be some resistance to what is really unjust and unbiblical law? So that developed over the centuries, and I've only in the last 4 or 5 years really started getting into this simply because of, we all experienced some pretty, what many think were bad laws back with the COVID era, with all the lockdowns, the infringement on our freedoms and basic civil rights. That's when I really started writing a lot of these pieces, because a lot of people are asking, hey, has the state gone too far here? Well, obviously, we're closing churches down, right? Keeping brothels open and, pubs, but closing down churches. Is there a place to resist? So, I keep those articles coming on this topic.
I can't help but notice one of your latest articles, and it's around this issue of resistance theory, but based on a little bit of Eastern European history here, and a former president in the Czech Republic, Vaclav Havel. Now, I don't think that he was a Christian. Can you set the scene for us why you're writing about Vaclav Havel and the sort of example he sets?
Yeah, well, you're right. As far as we know, he wasn't. He grew up in a Catholic home, but never really embraced it, as he said. Although some of the people he worked with during those heady days when the Soviets took over Czechoslovakia were devout Catholics. And he, of course, quotes Solzhenitsyn, who was a Christian as well, and also had his own work in resisting Russian communist oppression. So, I looked at his life partly because of a famous essay he wrote back around 1978 called, I've got it here, in fact, The Power of the Powerless, what people can do who, in theory, have no power against the powerful state, and how they might resist to stand up for human dignity, to stand up for freedom, and try to keep the state in check. So I thought, well, look, even though he's not a Christian himself, he was, very brave. We had a lot of resistance movements back in the 80s. Poland in solidarity. And of course, eventually the whole system came crumbling down. Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union disintegrated. Most of the Eastern European countries were freed from the shackles of communism. So his is just one of many important stories of really heroic figure who, as you say, eventually became the president of Czechoslovakia.
As you say, Bill, there were a lot of heroes, and especially Eastern Europe and, in fact, across Europe, where there have been resistance movements to what we might describe as totalitarianism. Now, if we're actually wanting the rubber to hit the road for what we are in Australia, we certainly are not under a totalitarian influence right now, but there are a lot of people who are warning that if we don't take some action and be a little resistant to the things that are coming, that totalitarianism, well, may be upon us. Any thoughts here about context for where we are in Australia?
Yeah, well, that's true. Many are warning. A lot of public intellectuals, Christian and otherwise, are concerned about where Australia and the West is heading. And again, many historical figures in the churches have been talking about this for ages, whether a Martin Luther or a John Calvin or a Francis Schaeffer more recently, or so many names that come to mind of Christians and thinkers who are saying, well, if the state gets more and more a law unto itself, more and more unresponsive to the needs of the people, less and less free and allowing people to have their own moral choices, can come in so many forms, right? Whether imposing homosexual ideology on a nation or really abusing the biblical and longstanding national idea of marriage. How far do we let it go before we have to start saying enough is enough? So Havel had to fight his back in Czechoslovakia. You're right, we're not quite at that place, but many are. Just as credit system in communist China, where the state keeps an eye on everybody, well, more and more in Australia, America, England, and so on, you're seeing the same kind of thing, a kind of surveillance state, kind of woke capitalism. We know about the big tech people, right, and how they often sided against individuals. Well, just getting kicked off of Facebook if you say the wrong thing. So that's kind of a soft totalitarianism already. And so the lessons that we can learn from people like Havel could well be helpful for us today.
How can we identify some of these lessons? Because it seems to me that he was experiencing the oppression, and then as the tables turn with his resistance, he eventually becomes the president of the Czech Republic. How do you see some of these lessons that we can see from Havel?
Yeah, well, what you just said is one clear lesson, right? Dictatorships, tyrannies, they don't necessarily last forever. They can come to an end. Sure, it takes a lot of prayer, it takes a lot of work, it takes people power, and you have to be willing to pay the price. So Havel was thrown into prison at various times, right? Valencia in Poland, you think of just so many countries, Albania, Romania, East Germany, heavy price to pay. A lot of people killed, a lot of people imprisoned, but in the end, the whole thing came crashing down. The Berlin Wall came down, and I lived to see it, right? Some of the listeners who are younger may not recall, but that was such a momentous event. So that is your first lesson, obviously. It doesn't have to continue. Tyranny doesn't have to exist if enough courageous souls speak truth and live truth. And that was a second, I suppose, lesson of Havel. I lost count. There must be at least 100 times in his 80-page essay where he mentions the word truth. And like Solzhenitsyn, he says, we cannot live by lies. We have to live by truth, and truth in the end will always overcome lies. So again, even as not necessarily a Christian, he knew that truth had power, and truth could overcome even some of the worst tyrannies around. So those are straight away several of the lessons we can take to heart.
He was aware that totalitarianism touches everyone, and I guess it takes those courageous people who will be able to speak up on behalf of others to actually make a difference. There are going to be needs, aren't there, for people with courage who understand the environment that they're in to be able to address these things, because not everybody understands this, Bill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that was part of what he complained about in his book. In fact, he really said he wasn't as much concerned about, the obvious things the communists were doing. He was concerned about the average person who in many ways either was apathetic or didn't care or just didn't want to rock the boat. It was safer and easier just to go along with the system, go with the regime, no matter how much it makes you have to be false to your own self. A lot of people just wanted to go along. And, well, we saw that in many ways with the masses going along with the egregious lockdown edicts, even here in Melbourne, in Australia, where we're so happy to see our churches closed, our human rights taken away. How many spoke out? Not many. Some brave pastors did. Some kept their churches open, and some were actually thrown in jail as a result. So again, another issue that Havel addresses, it's more the citizens who are too laid back or don't care or too fearful, too worried about retaliation. And again, it will come at a cost. It will come with a price to stand up against a regime that doesn't value human life. It'll be tough going. But we have to thank God that back then in the 70s and 80s, many people did, mostly Christians. And today we know that, the whole communist edifice is at least no longer out there in Europe and Russia as much as probably now in American and Australian university campuses. So the problem still exists, but it's shifted and gone in other directions.
Bill, come back to the ways that Christian believers can understand a level of empowerment when it comes to resistance. I know you make a reference in your latest article here about Havel that truth is the weapon of the dissidents. Sometimes we think of truth as some level of theory about what might be right and wrong, but truth as a weapon. How do you think of that?
Well, obviously for the Christian, we know the ultimate truth is, Jesus, who said, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life." So affirming truth, and much of this is simply affirming the Christian gospel, affirming the truth that God is king, Jesus is king, right? The Soviets aren't king. Some other utopian or dystopian leader who makes all these grand promises, they're not the king. Caesar was not the king, right? This has been a long-standing battle. In fact, even in Old Testament times, right? Daniel and his friends in Babylon, they all knew that the pagan rulers were not the real authority. Only Jesus is, or at least only God is. And therefore, standing at a time when even the majority might be against you, that's what we're always called to do. And I'm always reminded of that quote from Billy Graham a while ago, something about when you take a stand and are being courageous, you'll stiffen the spines of others to do the same. So, again, I know some of these pastors who were put in jail 4 or 5 years ago during the COVID badness. They inspired many to keep fighting the good fight. So again, we need to learn the lessons of history. There's a lot of evil that we can learn about, but we can learn a lot of good and how we can overcome evil, even if we're a small minority.
And the biblical truth we talk about as Christian believers, this is a timeless truth. So what was true yesterday is true today and will be true tomorrow. So when we arm ourselves with the truth, you make some reference there along the lines of Havel, of standing on that truth, not just in the resistance, but also in the moral reconstitution of a society. Once you're in the winning position, you have to still have a foundation on which to rebuild.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this goes back to everyday politics. We can look to some leaders as doing more good or some doing more harm. I think in many ways Trump is doing a lot of good. But we know as Christians, at the end of the day, he is not the Messiah. He is not going to save America. Just like at our forthcoming election, whether it's Albo again, Dutton gets in, one might be better than the other. I think that's the case. But again, they won't save Australia ultimately. But God works through governments. He works through people and how we vote. So, it comes down to the everyday. How do we live? How do we vote? How do we think about those who rule over us? That's all part of what it is to be Christian, what it is to be salt and light in a very fallen world.
Bill, great getting your update. And just to note that you end your latest article talking about this resistance with a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who said, "One word of truth outweighs the world." There's certainly very, very powerful wisdom in Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Hey, Bill, I'll point listeners to this latest article that we're talking about. And for listeners, you can find this at billmuehlenberg.com. You can simply Google Culture Watch, one word. The title of the article, Vaclav Havel, Truth and Resistance Theory. billmuehlenberg.com, or simply Google Culture Watch. Bill, thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
Thanks again, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.